Ahoy! It is finally time. In this video we'll talk about best in slot gear and we'll start the recommendations with light gear. What we're going to do is we're not just going to look at the typical gear recommendations that you've probably seen from other people and what kind of perks you want, but also the more complex stuff like what kind of defenses you want, what kind of gems you want along with that, and how to optimize that. In order to do all that, I did another video already where I explained the basics of what we need to pay attention to when it comes to damage, how much survivability we get. So I'm not going to repeat all of that. We're going to do a very quick speed run of that and then go straight into the numbers and then straight to the gear recommendations. I will link that video at the end as well if you're interested in more details on how exactly all of this works. So this first table is one that you should be familiar with already if you watched that very video, where I talked about the more dangerous sources of damage you can take. The example was a bruiser in OPR, but a lot of this would apply in light armor and in other situations as well. The damage sources may have slightly different priority. What's important here is that we have a lot of sources of damage that are reduced by Elemental Aversion, not that many and not that many big sources especially that are not reduced by Elemental Aversion on the elemental side, and then on the physical side we have a fairly even split when it comes to the damage output between ranged and melee physical damage, depending on who is primarily targeting you. We also have the blue perks here, which benefit from a few more base damage increases because they're used on int weapons, and the yellow perks that usually have less of those increases because they're often also used on physical melee weapons, for example. On the physical side, you can see that we have a very strong favor towards thrust damage, especially with ranged, and slash damage with melee, with only very little strike damage overall. This will be important for our amulets. Next, we did an overview based on this info chart from jesscapades. Keep in mind this info chart itself is slightly outdated. Some things about this were changed. These are the resulting charts. Again, I'm not going to go through all of that again. We have base damage increases of various kinds. We have some base damage decreases. We have fortifies, we have rends, and we have absorption. What I quickly want to show you are these examples at the bottom here, so you get a bit of an understanding on how base damage will actually affect you in a fight. So I wanted to test some scenarios and see how much base damage increases we get from various different perks. All of these scenarios don't assume any invigorated punishment stacks. There is always one stack assumed in any calculation that you'll see later when it comes to Shirking Fortification, because that is a self buff that activates it. But other than that, it heavily depends on how many buffs you have on yourself that are player created and not from consumables and so on. So it can be completely different depending on if you're using a life staff or if you're using an ice gauntlet or something. And it just varies heavily, and also not everyone is necessarily running invigorated punishment. The other reason why we don't assume invigorated punishment here is because we're assuming 100% Runeglass opal uptime. That's not realistic, that's not going to happen. We're assuming it for the sake of not having to balance invigorated punishment and opal all the time in the calculations. So we take out one, we leave in the other, and make that 100% instead. So we could also assume fully stacked invigorated punishment all the time. Kind of similar results. Under these assumptions, a Maelstrom after a Graph Well, for example, would get 12% from the Runeglass Opal, 5% from the Strength perk at 100 Strength, and 10% from the 200 Strength perk because the enemy is CC'd, so that would be a 27% increase. And we can go through this list a little bit. For example, you can see with the Bow basic attack, that would be 17%. With a Void Blade basic attack, which is very strong in that regard, is 37%. With a Detonate, it would actually be 0% because none of the perks that you would have as a melee player actually benefit the damage of your Detonate, and an Opal wouldn't activate it. After a Graph Well, however, you would get a 10% base damage increase. Pillar of Fire would be 27%. A Graph Well basic attack combo would be 37%. Again, that would be a very strong one. And a Leaping Strike from a sword would just be 17%. So you can see a lot of mix here depending on what kind of attack it is. If it's an ability, a basic attack, who is it coming from? And so you see kind of fluctuating values, the lowest ones being 0%, going up to 37%. Most of the stuff is somewhere in the area of 15 to 30%, I would say. And that brings us to the numbers. Huge thanks to jesscapades and XR here, they originally created these tables. I have heavily modified them since, so if there are any mistakes in here, don't blame them, that is on me because I did so much stuff with this. It's a bit messy at times. Here's a quick overview of how the Shirking Fortification table, for example, would look like. These are just like the fortify values at the top, the gem values at the top, the base damage values at the top, 2% assumed here for invigorated punishment, and then we get all the resulting values. But what interests us here are these tables. So the difference table is something I left in just so you can see it. I would say it's not actually that valuable. We'll have better information a little bit later. But the more important one is definitely the table at the top here, the effective health table. So this is effectively how much damage you can survive from that type. All of these tables assume balanced gems, so 4 Onyx, 4 Opal, so that it's fair when it comes to the base comparison. But we'll have more interesting results a little bit later. And then we have the armor loadouts. We have balanced, which makes sense. It's just balanced. High is when you have one value that's significantly higher, which makes the other value lower in return. So for example, if you have Shade Walker that has high physical and low elemental defense, so this would be the high value for physical armor, and this would be the low value for elemental. Can also be the other way around. You can also have high elemental armor and low physical. You can always look at the attacker medium numbers or attacker light numbers. I think both are interesting because both can attack you when you're in light, but mostly enemies are going to be light attackers, so it's light versus light, so this area here is probably the most important one for us. So if we had a balanced loadout with 5 times Elemental Aversion, this would be the physical side in terms of damage we're taking, because you're not getting any extra reduction. This would be the elemental side, and on Shirking Fortification, both sides would look like this. If we average these two values out, this would be the average in between, so we would, based on these numbers, assume, okay, Elemental Aversion is better than Shirking Fortification, you get like 1000 extra negation. But it's not that simple. On one hand, that assumes that all damage that is incoming is either physical or defended by Elemental Aversion, which is not the case. Even though those are the most important damage sources, there is still more damage than that. And it also assumes not too many external factors. And this is where a video comes in that Micro did recently, where he talked about including base damage modifiers in order to see how that affects the damage output. And I will show you a few examples of just that. If we increase the base damage by 15%, and as you just saw before, a lot of the time that is roughly how much damage you were taking. For example, if a bow shoots at you, they probably hit you with plus 15% base damage, or roughly that at least. Then these are resulting values, and those kind of numbers change things a little bit more in favor of Shirking Fortification, which will be more noticeable when we go to heavier armor loadouts, but it's also still noticeable to some degree here. If we push it further and assume the top end, the 30% base damage, then these are resulting values. You don't need to memorize these, we will focus on something that is more specific, but I want to show them anyways. And then if you go even further and you add 20% fortification, these would be your numbers. You could add some base damage reduction factors, but that's something that's not that important for light, because you're usually not using the types of weapons that primarily benefit from this. You could push this even further and, for example, include an Oak Flash Bomb on top of the fortification and base damage reduction, but again, not very applicable for light, because those are situations you will very rarely be in. You are kind of in the lower base damage and the lower fortification territories most of the time. And that is where we're moving back towards, because this is where, in my opinion, the really important stuff is. So I did my test based on a 15% base damage increase, because I think quite often the most dangerous damage that you're going to be taking is from those sources, especially bows and detonate. They are not that high in terms of base damage output, but I also did some 30% base damage comparisons. And my goal with the table that I created was to basically compare Elemental Aversion and Shirking Fortification on a more even level, and try to balance out the gems on an Elemental Aversion loadout in a way that you end up taking around the same physical damage as a Shirking Fortification loadout, so that you can more directly compare how much more or less damage you'll actually take. So by default, if we don't modify anything and we have balanced gems once again on a balanced armor, then we would have 14,659 effective health against both or all types of damage. If we had Shirking Fortification in the same loadout, then we would have 15,453 effective health. So this is our baseline. This is how much effective health we will need in physical in order to go even, and that's what we're going to try, and then see how much effective health we end up with in other areas. The first thing I tried was an elemental weighted armor, so high elemental armor with elemental aversion. In order to balance that out, I had to slot 8 onyxes, 8 physical gems, in order to get enough reduction going to compete with Shirking Fortification. You can see here that the resulting value is 15,580, so it is higher, but we have to deeply commit into onyx here, and then we have 16,300 elemental effective health. What lags behind a little bit is the melee damage. Now this is not actually just melee damage. I showed the chart before. There's some other stuff in there, like for example Ice Spikes on Ice Gauntlet, some other abilities that are also not affected the same way. Most of the damage again is affected, but those outliers will mean that you take a little bit more damage here. You have a little bit less effective health, around 14,000. I think this is a good trade-off still. I think this is absolutely okay, but it's one kind of shortcoming of this type of loadout. So this is something you'll have to keep in mind for everything that comes down the road. One of the things that will definitely set these builds apart is that when it comes to specialized damage, melee damage, then Shirking Fortification usually comes out ahead. So if you are very, very, very scared of Void Blades in particular, I don't know why you would be in light, you can just roll away, but if you are, then Shirking Fortification would actually give you more survivability specifically against that and against that only. Against most other sources of damage, you will have at least the same or significantly more effective health, and at this point it's worth pointing out that Shirking Fortification doesn't work the same way that Elemental Aversion works. Elemental Aversion is always active, Shirking Fortification requires you to dodge effectively first, and you have somewhat limited dodges in light, at least. Next I tried the same thing with a balanced loadout, and the result is incredibly similar. If you look at the numbers, they're just pretty much the same. It's such a slight difference that it's not even worth discussing here. We're talking about 50 effective health. I don't even know why Elemental is slightly better in that regard. I think it's just something about stacking it between high Elemental and then the Aversion. But either way, really the same thing. The only difference here is you're now running 6 Onyxes and only 2 Opals, but still more Opals than before. And then I tried the exact same thing again, but with physical armor. In this case, you can see that the values are, again, slightly lower, but hardly worth mentioning. Again, roughly 50 effective health less, so really not a problem. And we can see here that now we can actually run very balanced gems. We can run 4 Onyxes and 4 Opals, and even though our armor is Phys weighted, this will result in very balanced mitigations because Elemental Aversion is offsetting the rest. Just for the fun of it, I also threw in what it would look like with thrust protection on the physical side. This is, by the way, not just for Elemental Aversion, this is something you can also do with Shirking Fortification. But you can see that even though these values are balanced right now, the moment I put in thrust protection and I compare it against thrust damage, the effective health will suddenly be a lot higher on the physical side. This also means that you don't necessarily need to go as high on the physical side if you're only scared about one type of damage, but we'll discuss that a little bit later. But as promised, I also tested the same thing with 30% base damage. I didn't go through all the different examples here because the results were obvious from the first test already. As you can see, this is the normal value, this is the Shirking Fortification value, here's the physical value for Elemental Aversion, and here's the elemental value for Elemental Aversion. The difference is a little bit smaller, obviously, because base damage affects Elemental Aversion a little bit more, but it's still 400 above, and then you take the trade-off here on the damage that is not reduced by Elemental Aversion again, but in my opinion, that's not a big deal because it's so few sources of damage. So especially in light, the base damage factor is actually very minor. But there was one last scenario that I wanted to test out as well, which was physical aversion, because there is a set that you can currently get very cheap with physical aversion. Here, the numbers are a little bit different. You see one value for elemental this time, because we don't have elemental aversion, so that's not split. So you will have 15,522 elemental effective health, and this is with 6 Opals. We need this amount of Opals in order to reduce the elemental damage sufficiently, but we also still need some Onyxes. Against ranged physical damage, we obviously have very good damage reduction now because it's 16,300 roughly, but our problem is physical melee damage, where our effective health is significantly lower now, and that's why we have those 2 Onyxes, because otherwise we'd just not survive it at all, and it's still very, very low. This is a damage source that is a much bigger problem than elemental melee damage, simply because there isn't that much elemental melee damage or unmitigated elemental damage that avoids elemental aversion. On the other hand, there are tons of different sources of physical melee damage, as you probably know, and there are those schizo builds that specifically go after you if you are in light and probably not geared heavily against physical melee in the first place. So you are taking a heavy cut here. You can kinda gear around it somewhat, but it's still definitely a big risk, which is why I would say in most situations this build is not ideal unless you're just getting targeted by bows and muskets pretty much. And that brings us to direct gear recommendations, but before I show you that, I want to show you one more number, and it's this number. And I don't want this number to go above the number that it is. I don't want this number to go above 69, I hope you understand. So please help me keeping this number on 69, or maybe even below that would be great. Jokes aside, I did not include elemental armor here because I think that is the most inflexible option, so I would just not recommend it as a best in slot loadout. You are forced to have 8 Opals, and even with that, you're just barely making it, so if they're making any changes to physical melee weapons that would make them stronger and more dangerous, then you would have a massive problem. As such, my first recommendation is this: a Phys weighted loadout with 5 times elemental aversion, no Shirking Fortification, 4 Onyxes or less if you're not that focused on the physical side, and 4 Opals or more if you want to avoid a little bit more elemental damage. I don't see any benefit in running a Shirking Fortification loadout in light because the uptime is just more risky, and the benefit of just having slightly more mitigation against Void Blade specifically and a few other outlier cases does not justify losing all of the elemental mitigation that you can get, or physical if you swap your gems around a little bit, so I don't think it's ever worth running Shirking Fortification. If you're running this loadout with Elemental Aversion, then I would recommend using Thrust or Slash Protection on your amulet. Which one you're using really depends more on what you're mostly getting attacked by, what you're most scared of, what kind of fighting scenario you're in. For example, in wars, you will often know what type of enemy is focusing you the most and what the team composition of the enemy war team is. In arenas, you will very clearly see what your enemies are running, especially after the first round. And in OPI, you just have to get your feel for it depending on the day, if the bows are worse or if the melee skitchels are chasing you. I do not recommend any flame protection amulet because there is really no reason to. When you already have 5 elemental aversion, you have other ways to mitigate that damage better, and that's just highly specialized against fire staff specifically, whereas thrust and slash both cover a ton of different damage sources, which in my opinion is a lot more effective and important. This is, by the way, also what, in my opinion, makes elemental aversion better than physical aversion, because you can much easier build around the physical damage through your jewelry, while the elemental damage is taken care of by your armor. The other way around just doesn't work that well. As the consumable for this loadout, I would recommend either a fire absorption potion, if fire damage is a huge problem for you, or oak flesh balm. Now you may be saying, well, you didn't originally recommend oak flesh balm because you said it's not that high in terms of scaling, and it isn't, but let me show you something. In a balanced loadout with elemental aversion, this would be our damage taken from a physical attack, because we don't have any significant special mitigations against that. So roughly 13,200. With the Oak Flesh Bomb, this would be 14,400, so just a little over 1,000 extra mitigation or extra effective health. On the other hand, our elemental effective health would be 15,200. This is significantly higher because of elemental aversion. Now if we use a Fire Absorption Potion, then we get roughly 3,000 extra effective health. On top of that, Fire Absorption Potion also has a longer uptime. So in many situations, the Fire Absorption Potion will be the better option because it just covers that particular damage better. But with Oak Flesh, you have to keep in mind that it covers more than just one type of damage. It covers thrust damage, ranged thrust damage especially, it covers slash damage, and it even covers strike damage. So it's just a bigger all-rounder. Particularly in the Phys weighted loadout, it also gets some extra benefit from you having more physical armor, which makes the Oak Flesh Bomb stronger compared to other loadouts. I do mention it here as a secondary choice, especially effective in situations where you can have 2 different consumables on your bar, like for example in arenas. The secondary loadout follows a very similar same-ish idea, and that is the balanced loadout. You've already seen it before, see it again here in a more clear overview. The only difference is that we're now running 6 onyxes and 2 opals. Keep in mind, I again put a minus on the onyx here, because you can very easily run less if you just use your amulet for the extra protection. So if you're primarily scared about slash, then you just use a slash protection amulet, and you can take out some of the onyxes and offset that with the opal. What you can also do in both cases is go a step further. You don't have to run onyxes. You can run certain specified gems. You can run a thrust protection gem. You can run a slash protection gem. And you can sometimes get more effectiveness out of that if it works for your specific role. I would recommend not overdoing it though, because if you ever get hit by a different source, like for example strike damage, you'll have less mitigation. So this can become a problem if you overdo it. In terms of amulet and consumable, we have the same recommendations here. Oak Flesh is going to be a little bit less effective because this is a balanced loadout, but the same thing still applies. The values that I showed you were from a balanced loadout anyways. So there are rarer use cases, but they exist. And then we have the budget loadout, which is the Springtide Bloom version. I would generally not necessarily recommend this unless you know that you're just going to run into a lot of bows shooting at you all the time, and that's your main problem. Again, in this loadout, you're running at least 2 onyxes just to survive melee damage a little bit somehow, and then 6 opals or less, but you're gonna take some more hits somewhere, especially because the balance of the set is balanced as well. You can't force it into one direction or the other. When it comes to your amulet here, I would recommend slash most of the time. If melee damage is a concern to you at all, then this should be your first line of defense, because the thrust damage is mostly covered by your physical aversion. There are outliers like sword and shield, but it's not as many as the slash weapons. The alternative perk would be Flame Protection here, simply because this loadout has much less elemental damage reduction. So if mages are a big concern to you, you're getting hit by fire mages a lot, then you probably want to have something against that. Again, this is not ideal. The other way around is way better in my opinion. Elemental Aversion with Slash or Thrust just works better in general because it covers more bases. The consumable here would be fire and then oak flesh or whatever. It probably isn't oak flesh most of the time because you probably would want an ice protection consumable, but that doesn't exist, so what are you gonna do? You could probably also go with a gemstone dust, but really, again, nothing is ideal here. This is a budget loadout. You'll have to live with certain parts of it just not being as great as on the other ones. And that brings us to a more general best in slot overview for light. I will say that I may have overlooked or forgotten something here. I'm not 100% on this one. This is something I added as the last part and I just wanted to get done with it. But I hope this covers the most important basics of this type as well. So let's just have a look at it. The first part is our armor. We have Resilient, which we absolutely want on our armor. We also have this. Oh, look at that. How did this come in here? Then we have Elemental Aversion, which is what I would recommend in general. Though if you cannot get it and it is not an option at all, then Shirking Fortification still isn't bad. If you have pieces that still have Shirking Fortification, it's also not bad. I showed you the tables. It will still give you significant damage mitigation over not having any of those perks. So I would not say don't get anything at all. And even if the enemy has Invigorated Punishment, usually Shirking Fortification will outweigh that. Elemental Aversion, highly preferable, but if you have a very good piece with Shirking Fortification, don't throw it in the trash if you want to run it. Your third perk is ideally Freedom most of the time, because in light that is just very effective, and if you get engaged upon, that's the easiest way to get out. Some players prefer Refreshing. I'm not the biggest fan of it, but I think it is still okay. But in general, what you want more than Refreshing are weapon perks that you require for whatever weapon you're running. One outlier are your legs. Here you want Resilient, Elemental Aversion, or Freedom. Especially if you're playing Arena, you may prefer Freedom over Elemental Aversion here. Some people just want to have that freedom over the extra damage mitigation. And then Shirking Energy. So either of these options here is fine. Shirking Energy is something that I would highly recommend having if you're running light. The amulet one is quick. You want health, stamina recovery, and some type of protection. I mentioned the protection on the last slide, so to speak, so we don't need to talk about that again. There isn't really any discussion here. There's nothing in light especially that competes with stamina recovery. There's nothing that really competes with health to a larger degree, so these are just what you want, and I highly dislike this. I think it's very stupid that there's only one best in slot option for amulet for each protection type, and that's it. The other perks are just not on the same level. But for now, that's the situation that we have to live with. On the ring, we are a lot more flexible. We want to have Hardy on the ring, especially if we are in light. We want to have some type of damage increase most of the time. So for example, slash damage if you're running a Schizo build, or fire damage or whatever else you're running. If you're a healer, you would want to run Sacred there. Or you can also run Keen Awareness, because some builds benefit a lot from getting extra crit, sometimes over getting extra damage. So for those outliers, that could also be an effective way, which is very nice because it ties into Invigorated Punishment, which means you can just use Champion's Ring. If that is not the case for you, then obviously you can go Hearty plus damage plus Invigorated Punishment, or you can go Hearty plus some extra damage plus Keen Awareness. So quite a few good options. And then there are also third specialty perks. I'm going to show you a few here. This is probably not comprehensive. Again, I didn't go too deep into this, but depending on what kind of loadout you're running, if you're, for example, running a musket in OPR for whatever reason, you might run Mortal Empowerment. If you're running a Fire Staff, you might run Burning. If you're running a Bleed Rapier, you might run Bloodletting. Yeah, so there are some options. I'm not a fan of leeching on light in particular, but all of those are there, and some people prefer different things here. When it comes to the earring, you typically want Refreshing Toast, Purifying Toast, assuming you have a regen potion on your bar. If you cannot have that on your bar because you're already using other consumables that are more important, then the alternative option is likely Refreshing. And your third perk here would be Nimble, or if you're one of those people that doesn't like Nimble, then you would go Refreshing there. Not really all too much flexibility on earrings overall. And I want to leave a note here as well, and that is that a good 2-perker is better than a bad 3-perker. For example, you'll see a lot of people that see something like Resilient, Shirking Fortification, and Vigor. This is likely worse than just buying a purple piece with Resilient and Elemental Aversion, unless you are specifically looking for a Shirking Fortification build. There is this mindset that gold shiny things with 3 perks are generally what you want and what's better, but often that is not necessarily true. Especially Resilient plus Elemental Aversion is such an effective and strong combo that often it just outclasses other things. Likewise, especially in Light, even Resilient and Freedom can often outclass other things that have a third perk on them. Of course, ideally you want both, but you probably can't always afford that. The same thing is true for your Amulet, for example. A lot of people may be running around with something that, for example, has health and then has fortified recovery and refreshing, which, yeah, it's technically okay, but it's probably better to have an amulet that just has health and stamina recovery, or health and a specific type of protection, because the overall survivability that you get from that is probably going to be higher in most situations. One thing that I didn't touch upon here is runeglassing your armor gems. I would generally not recommend doing that at the moment unless you're very, very confident in what you're doing and you are very sure that you're not going to take much damage most of the time and just going to be positioning so well that it's not a problem. Realistically, you are taking a lot more damage now as a light armor player than you used to, and especially if you are used to just getting attacked by a few ranged players and a lot of melees, now there will be a lot more ranged players attacking you overall, which means you just have to gear more against damage that is coming towards you as well. I am not a fan of reducing the mitigations that you have in favor of increasing your damage, though I understand the appeal of it, and I know that some people say, okay, if I get attacked I'm probably dead anyways, so I might as well deal more damage while I'm not. So I understand the perspective. In that case you can run the same loadouts and just put Runeglass on however many gems of both kinds as you want, but I personally am currently, with the damage mitigation that's going around, not a fan of it. I think since the fortified changes that it's just a very risky thing to do. Now this was a massive amount of work, but we're not done. This was only light. We have to talk about heavy and we have to talk about medium. If you're interested in that, consider subscribing and clicking the bell. And also, if you appreciate the work I did here, then please leave a like, leave a comment, anything that supports this video somehow. Share it with your friends, watch it multiple times, whatever it takes. If you'd like to support me further and also get early trading tips, then you can do that on Patreon. I've been posting a lot of tips lately. I'd like to thank my patrons who already do exactly that. And now I can finally rest. Thanks for watching. Duke Sloth, out.